I would like to start with giving the floor straight away to our partner, the GMF office here in Warsaw and the GMF in general, and Michał Baranowski, the head of the Warsaw office, to moderate the first panel with a fantastic session about West versus Russia, or how our Russian friend said, rather the Kremlin versus the West.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It is working. Excellent. Thank you, Kasia. Welcome all. It's an honor to be here, and I must say I'm so impressed with the second edition of the Warsaw Security Forum. It's really Kasia's, Byszek, and whole team. You are doing an amazing job, and it's fantastic for GMF to be part of this. And it's what a pleasure to start morning on a note of talking about Russia and the West versus Russia. Innocent title, I must say. Somebody thought of it well. I wanted to first welcome panelists. You have their bios on the website or in your program, so you can read it in detail. But we have 4 excellent panelists representing 8 perspectives, and I will explain in a second. To my left is Constanze Stelzenmüller, a Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at Brookings in Washington, D.C., formerly with GMF, so both D.C. and Berlin perspective strongly represented. Dan Twining, a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, American, so D.C. perspective, but living in Tbilisi, so a little bit going east, but also someone who's focusing heavily on Asia. So we'll talk about Russia and Asia angle as well. Jerzy Pomianowski, whom many of you know very, very well, Executive Director of the European Endowment for Democracy, formerly with the Polish MFA, Deputy Minister, Ambassador, an excellent bio that you can look up after the discussion. And we have Ilya Ponomarev with us, member of Duma, the only member who voted against annexation of Crimea. Thank you for this. Representing Moscow, but not a Kremlin perspective, as we said very clearly. Living currently in California, so we have Californian perspective as well. Very brief intro. I mean, the subject in many ways does not require the whole a lot of introduction because we follow it in the media every day. But I would say that the relations with Russia are worse now, not only since the end of Cold War, but probably since the mid-1970s. Helsinki Final Act was signed in 1975. We are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, yet the annexation of Crimea is something that absolutely upended the principles and really the principles that underpin the European security order. Western Russian troops now face each other really in the whole arc, going from the high north through the Baltic all the way to Syria. And NATO is in the process of reinforcing its flanks both in the south and the east. And we'll be talking in more detail about the NATO summit, but we'll touch upon the military aspect of the relations with Russia as well. And the Russian troops are still very much in Ukraine. Russia continues SNAP exercises. It flies flights without transponders. And we are in increasing risk of accidental confrontation, possible escalation. Many say that we are closer to possibility of war, accidental or otherwise, than we have been in a very, very long time. So I would like our panel to address where we are, but in the end, get to the point to how do we get to a robust Western strategy toward Russia, this Kremlin. I like the distinction between Russia and the Kremlin. Can we fix it in any way? Or do we have to, or is this the world we're going to live in for a long time and we just have to manage it? I want to first turn to Constanze, because you are sitting in DC, but you are very frequently in Berlin. I would say 2 capitals who are and maybe I would flip it almost, Berlin and DC drive the policy, Western policy toward Russia. There is an increasing talk in both capitals about avoiding escalations. Give us your perspective, sitting in both Berlin and DC. Where are we going? There are even talks about new détente. Is this something that you would put on a horizon as well?
All right, thank you, Michał. That's a big question. I'll try to be succinct. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. And the groovy disco ball lighting on a Friday morning is definitely something new. Now, I sometimes think I spent most of my life in planes, not so much sitting in Washington or Berlin. But I mean, you're right that Washington and Berlin have cooperated on this extremely closely. I sometimes think it's a good metaphor for describing the way the White House and the Chancellery have worked together on this. Is sort of like a zipper. It's been really, I think, an unusual example, apart from the Iran negotiations, where transatlantic cooperation has been as close as on few other topics. And I think the Germans have been gratified by the fact that this administration listened to them on many key points, and I think took their advice on a number, such as the timing of sanctions, the extent of sanctions, and so on. I'm not particularly worried about Western strategy towards Russia in the short run. I think the sanctions are going to be renewed. There can be no question of that, simply because the conditions of Minsk elections in the time schedule can't be fulfilled until that point. So there is no doubt about that. That said, there is a great deal of pressure, particularly in Europe, from more vulnerable countries vulnerable to Russian bullying or Russian blandishments, to loosen sanctions, to re-engage in the long run. And I would add that the foreign ministers of both the US and Germany, I think, are people who, by their temperament, have diplomacy as their default mode, and I think are always seeking ways to engage. That said, I'm not sure that that is wrong in principle, as long as we get the deterrent part of this right. I think that we have to make a careful distinction between then whom we're trying to engage. I'm all for engaging Russian civil society, and I'm for engaging the Russian government where it can be constructive, such as on the Iran negotiations. On many other fields, I have my doubts.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned deterrence, and we'll come back to this, because I think we are clearly having very important conversation about it within the alliance, where, well, we also have slightly different perspectives, to say the least. But we'll come back to this. Dan, I wanted to pick you a little bit more on the U.S. view. U.S. military is now talking with the Russian military in Syria. We are entering also U.S. presidential campaign, where this is somewhat of an issue. You have worked for Senator McCain, so you also have, maybe you can present the view a little bit looking from the Republican side as well. How do where is U.S. on the grand thinking vis-a-vis Russia? How do you see the next year and a half of the current administration, or, well, a year and 3 months play out? And what can we expect after the elections?
Thanks, Michael. So, very happy to be here. Thanks for the chance to be with you. I think the first thing I would say is that U.S.-Russia policy, I suspect, is going to become a bit harder, irrespective of whether a Democrat or a Republican succeeds President Obama in the Oval Office. This is quite interesting, actually. In a way, it's more interesting from a Democratic perspective, because Hillary Clinton, of course, you can watch it on YouTube, announced the reset with Russia in March 2009, only 6 months after the invasion of Georgia. And it looked like a very jolly affair when you watched the video. I mean, she was sort of smiling. It looked like she was having fun. I think what this means is that there's going to be pressure on her, if she's president, to take a harder line, because the reset manifestly failed. I don't particularly think it failed for US reasons. I think it failed because it misunderstood the nature of the Russian regime. So it's not to put the blame on us. But it's to say that I think there will be pressure on her to stake out a tougher position than President Obama has, because we've all learned a lot about Russia over the last 7 years of his administration. Really, we've learned a lot since 2008, since the invasion of Georgia. On the Republican side, I mean, the leading Republican candidates have all been a little more hawkish, really recognizing that we're back in a world of great power competition. I think recognizing that leading from behind has not worked, particularly in the Middle East, where it has created openings for Russia. And so I suspect you see a slightly harder line. Now, it's also a chance for a new administration to take on a new set of issues more broadly with respect to Russia. And funnily enough, while I'm not sure there's a lot of cooperation we can look forward to in kind of the wider European space or in the Middle East, it may be that there is a chance for some cooperation in Asia. And I don't know if you want to come back to this, but just maybe in a sentence or two, Russia's greatest strategic challenge does not lie in the West, right? Russia to the West confronts a set of prosperous, successful democracies. I mean, again, from Georgia all the way up through Ukraine and into the European Union. Russia to the east confronts a rising superpower that is going to present a fundamental military and strategic challenge to Russia's position in the international order. And so I think we might see over the next few years Putin himself maybe pivoting away from China and Asia, which he has done in response to Western sanctions, et cetera, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, and maybe pivoting towards the United States. If he were smart, this is what he would do, if he were genuinely strategically intelligent.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Minister Pomianowski. I wanted to ask for the perspective from the key aspects of strategy toward Russia from Warsaw. What are the key things that transatlantic strategy toward Russia would have to hit to be acceptable and appreciated here? And also putting on your other hat of director of the European Endowment for Democracy, you are in the business of democracy and democracy promotion, and we will talk a little bit more about the domestic factors driving the Russian foreign policy. To what extent do you think the West can impact what's going on domestically, internally in Russia? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michał, and thank you very much for Warsaw Security Forum for invitation. As you rightly said, I'm now based in Brussels for about 2.5 years, so maybe I'm not the best one to say about Polish specific perspective, especially that it is going to change. We are going to have a new government in just a few days, so we will hear a lot of new interesting statements. As yesterday, we could hear also Minister Jerzy presenting his opinions. But in principle, I believe the main focus of Poland will not change. We are the ones in this part of Europe, and we are the ones in Europe and in the world that were trying to attract attention to the very bad trends that were happening to the world, and especially that were taking place in Russia over the last 5, 10, 15 years. We were inviting everybody to read Putin's speeches. We were asking people, how do you understand this or that speech, whether it was in Bucharest or any other places all over the world. And also, we were asking same questions, have we done enough after invasion and war in Georgia? So that was a huge dilemma of Polish foreign policy over those years. If we are too strongly addressing, or if we were too strongly addressing those issues, we were immediately labeled as Russophobes and troublemakers. If we were too softly trying to maneuver around, we were accused of not being enough vocal about this subject. So there was an enormous political intellectual trap where we were dragged over those years. And unfortunately, only invasion on Ukraine and annexation of Crimea finally opened eyes of the world, and we started to discuss the issue in the real terms, in the way as it should be. But at the same time, I want to say that this predominant now focus of Western politicians and think tanks to take the security dimension, although understandable and necessary, is in my view, again, another trap. Dropping core values, democracy, from the agenda, it's actually now should be treated as a Moscow success. Because this is exactly how Putin would like to frame relationship with the world, and especially with the West, saying there are certain security issues and there is a security struggle and there is a geopolitics, so let's make a deal. Well, let's make a deal when I already did what I did. So it reminds a very old habit that the bandit enters your house and negotiates the way that will give you back half of it. So that is not acceptable, and that's why we need to be very, very firm, black and white and sharp in every sense, including terminology, including respect to our own regulations. Look what happens. Recently, Deutsche Bank is going to pay fine for money laundering, and that includes also Russian oligarchs' money. So do we respect our own rule of law? Do we respect our own values on our own territories? It's not the case. Same with the Russian propaganda. Do we address properly the issue of so many false messages that are present on our territory? And here, having so many military people, we know that the best strategy is to fight a war on the enemy's territory. So why we are not addressing this issue and why we are not helping independent debate inside Russia and in Russian language media space? The Russian language does not belong to Putin. There are many Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriots, Russian-speaking Moldavians, Latvians, Estonians, and they do not share concept of Ruski Mir, but they need support, they need means to have a voice, to become vocal, and to create alternative to the narrative that is triggered by Putin and Kisilov. So we have to change our way of doing, and we have to see things in a very multidimensional way.
Great, thank you very much. And I wanted to turn to Mr. Ponomarev to address also the limits of illiberal democracy when it comes to foreign policy. If you can, we look at the public opinion polls, 85% support for Putin, let alone the methodology and whether people are able to speak freely. But if you could tell us a little bit how to read these, and also the domestic drivers of Putin's foreign policy, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Dzień dobry, szanowni państwo. Don't worry, I'll speak in English. Thank you very much for the wonderful question, because I think that the most important thing, if you want to cure the illness, you should understand where it's coming from. And that 85%, which I personally do believe are genuine, 85%, and it's not a fake 85%, and some of my opposition-minded colleagues suggest. I think that by understanding where it's coming from, you can actually understand how to address this. I think that during the last 25 years of free market reforms in Russia, they were administered so badly, and the actual democracy has never been built inside Russia. That's why all those approaches, they are deeply associated inside Russian people with poverty and the sense of frustration that nothing can be done against this poverty and chaos and corruption prevails Russian public. That's why when they were given the option to feel the sense of greatness once again, and it's not sense of greatness in terms of imperialistic greatness, that we will conquer the world. No, it's the other sense of greatness. It's that we will liberate the world, that Western powers are now conquering Ukraine, and they want to repeat 1990s in Ukraine, and we Russians are supposed to liberate our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. We need to prevent fascist coup, which is happening in Kiev, nationalist uprising. We are to protect them. If you ask how many Russians want to conquer Kiev, you will get very low numbers. You know, some will, for sure. There is an imperialistic part in every population, but those numbers would be maybe 10%, something like that. Overwhelming majority of Russians don't want to conquer. They want to liberate. They are continuing World War II. They are continuing the deed of our ancestors, of our grandfathers, you know, of our grandfathers, of our fathers. And that's feel we cannot change power inside Russia, but we can still be good. And that's what drives the population. And I think that it was already several issues touched here, like the issue of propaganda. Firstly, of course, I don't believe that you can counter one propaganda with another propaganda. And secondly, that, you know, talking military language, you don't have just to create weapons, but you need to create weapons, means of delivery of those weapons to the enemy territory. And there is no means of delivery of any propaganda, counter-propaganda measures on Russian territory, because the TV signal, you know, has very short range, and Russians are not using satellite dishes; they're using cable TV, so it's not really feasible to deliver that message. But it really doesn't matter, because even if you have like Voice of America or something like that in every single household, people will simply not watch it, because the message of Russian propaganda is extremely comfortable. And this is what people want to hear. During the Chechen War in 1990s, whatever the government propaganda was that time, it was not that efficient inside Russia, because people didn't feel that the Chechen War is something proper. People now feel that the war in Ukraine is something that we need to do, and we are ready to suffer. And the sanctions, they are just reinforcing Russian public in this opinion that we are suffering, but that's a noble suffering. This is something that we have to do for our brothers in Ukraine. And unfortunately, that's what dominates the society. And Putin, as the person who is very weak in economy, very weak in strategy, but he is brilliant in manipulating people's minds. That's what he was trained for, and that's what he does for A+.
Let me follow up on this a little bit. If you could offer any ideas or your thoughts on countering, though, this A+ behavior, and your ideas on bringing change to Russia, both from within, and if you have any thoughts on bringing the change from outside, unless it's totally out of the question. And just a sort of one on the foreign policy side, you mentioned the popularity and so how the war in Ukraine resonates. Well, what about the Middle East? What about Syria? And now with the plane, most likely terrorist attack, does this change the calculus, both within Kremlin, but also how the public perceives Putin's foreign policy?
The question of changes inside Russia, of course, is fundamental for myself as a Russian politician. And the more I am thinking about this, and everybody asks me, you know, how West can help. And as time passes, I think that the best answer is to stay away. Whatever you have done about Russia was wrong, and at best counterproductive. You can do a lot of good things on your own territory. For example, if we are talking about the same propaganda, I just would like to remind that Russian language is number 5 most spoken languages in the European Union. It's in no countries is the government language, but still is one of the most popular languages. In the United States, you can go and make a driver's license fully in Russian. File papers, say in New York, you can do them all in Russian, all government papers. Where in European Union you can do the same. And this is very powerful because instead of trying to create new media channels you can legalize the status of Russian language in the European Union, and that's the most powerful message that you can actually send to Russian population, that you do care about Russians. Yesterday, I think it was Mr. Koval who was speaking about Erasmus program, and that's the most powerful tool of soft power. Russia has always resisted in participating in Erasmus, and I think it was a conscious decision because that's really a source of important influence. Open Erasmus programs unilaterally for Russian students. That's the most powerful way how you can work with a younger population without actually doing something on Russian territory and without doing something that would be considered as a hostile and disruptive move. And the last thing is there was this issue about Deutsche Bank and then corruption and whatever. The population of Miami, Russian population of Miami, just recently surpassed 1 million people. And this 1 million is usually kids, wives, lovers of those who stole money in Russia and moved there. How many of the same are in Côte d'Azur in France? How many of them are in Italy? How many of them are in United Kingdom? It's also millions of people. And they are not being investigated as a source of a capital because it's profitable for Western countries to have those people on board. And this is what has been discussed all the time in Russia, that those who are giving protection to our corruptioneers is also Western democracies.
Thank you very much. When you said, stay away from Russia, and made me think of this, paraphrasing a saying from the communist times. You might not be interested in Russia, but Russia is interested in you. It was about the party. I wanted to follow on what you said, what the West should do in its own backyard, not sort of our own yard, not even backyard. Minister Pomianowski, if you could pick up on anything actually that Ilya said, but especially on some of the challenges that we are getting from on the edge of European Union when it comes to Russian informational warfare campaigns.
Thank you. Yes, we have not much time, so we have to be very brief in the messages. Indeed, Endowment, for example, has embarked on preparing a big report on what we can do in Russian language media space to enable a little bit bigger chance for open debate and to create certain balance. And definitely one of the conclusions of this report was exactly what Ilya said, that you cannot fight this kind of propaganda with the traditional counter-propaganda tools. What we can do a step-by-step enlargement of the intellectual and open debate that is allowing Russian people and Russian-speaking people in the whole region to have an alternative. And again, we are entering the space that is deliberately dominated by several media controlled by Kremlin, and the process took place 15 years. And we were doing nothing about this when we could still do to protect independent media in Russian language in this very space, inside Russia and outside Russia. I would disagree with only one thing with Ilya, that to my view, the society perspective, if I look into Russia, is not that dark. There are many Russians like Ilya who are thinking same way. They are not openly speaking because they are just afraid, but they are ready to have chance to at least demonstrate by subscription of certain media that they are interested in alternatives. So, and we're not talking about 2 or 3%, we are talking about 10, 15, 20, sometimes 25%. It is an important change. If they would have their own media, they can participate, they can consume. So one of key recommendation that we are trying to say is that we need to find a ways, and there are ways, to help those media growing, strengthening, and also building regional structures, uniting in the whole region, Ukrainian media, Baltic media, those inside Russia. We still have some independent media in Russia, Novaya Gazeta, TV Dość, we have Medusa in Riga. So there are possibilities. Internet is still free in Russia. So yes, TV channels, difficult to penetrate. But if we take a different strategy, multiplying options and integrating them into some kind of cooperative systems, that can work. But that requires also much more attention on our side and, of course, much more funding.
Absolutely. Well, that's a very strong message. Well, we should mark this. I know, Constanze, you wanted to react.
I'd like to pick up on this as well. I think Ilya Ponomarev has made a very important point, which is that the difference between Stalin's Russia and today's Russia is that people who want to and who still have the means can move, and they already are moving in large quantities. I mean, it's not just expats and investment that's leaving Russia, but people are following their children, literally, and in very large quantities. I was just in Moscow. A record number of diversity visa applications this year has come out of Russia. But I also agree with our other speaker that I think you need to look very carefully at the opinion inside Russia. One of the more surprising things to me in Moscow was to go to the place where Boris Nemtsov was killed on the bridge leading to the Kremlin. There are about 20 meters of vases with fresh flowers there, pictures and texts. Apparently they're removed on a regular basis and then they come back. I think that tells you something. You know, there was a minder there, but that was it. And there were a lot of people looking at this and discussing this. That said, given the way that the Putin government is currently cracking down on free media, I'm not sure that it is... I think we have to be very careful, let me put it this way, and very responsible about what we encourage inside Russia and what we do outside of Russia. I'm all for increasing or offering Erasmus unilaterally. I think that's an extremely good idea. In fact, I've been arguing that as well. The other thing that I think we may have to think of doing is helping Russian NGOs that can no longer live and operate in Russia and who are now moving to Poland, to Vilnius, to Prague, and support them there. To my knowledge, that's already happening, but I think there needs to be a concerted effort to do that. And I don't see why Europe and why America shouldn't support the publication of independent, creative Russian language media in Europe. Yeah. And finally, and this is another point that you raised, it's not just the Russian language in Europe. I think we have to be sort of very, very careful in the way that we establish rights for Russian-speaking minorities in Europe, and particularly, of course, in the Baltics. I think that I completely understand our Baltic friends' concern about their Russian minorities. But I think the reality is that a comfortably integrated Russian minority in the three Baltic states is the single biggest sign of European soft power that these countries could send towards Russia. And I think that we need to find the right balance and help our friends find the right balance between making sure that these minorities don't serve the purpose of another country, but at the same time feel safe and respected in the countries where they now live. I mean, they are clearly not leaving for Russia in droves. They may not be happy with where they live, but they're not about to leave and go back to Russia. So I think that tells us something, and I think that needs to be encouraged and respected as well. So there's a great deal of many, many things that we can do, but I think in the long run, we have to think about what happens to Russia and what happens to Europe in particular, and perhaps somewhat less to America, if the Russian middle classes, if the Russian intelligentsia, flow out to Europe and resettle there because they don't think they can have a safe and productive life in their own country. I think that would be a tragedy for Russia, but it also has enormous implications for us.
Dan.
So I just wanted to come back to this question of the link between the domestic and the external. Putin's numbers at 85%, they were not 85% in kind of the 2012-2013 period. In fact, the Mike McFaul thesis is that Putin realized he was in great trouble domestically during this 2012-2013 period, with parliamentary elections that his party came close to losing, with a presidential return, and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in Moscow. And so the McFaul thesis is that Putin created a foreign adventure in Crimea and Ukraine to get those numbers back up to where they are now. And we can debate this all day, but I think one can make a pretty straightforward case that the way to influence Russian domestic politics is not for the West to meddle within Russia, it's to deny Putin foreign policy victories that he then uses to mobilize support for his repressive methods at home. And that means denying him the opportunity of a victory in Ukraine. It means denying him the opportunity of a victory in Syria. But it also means taking on more directly this Russian interference in the internal affairs of European countries like Moldova and Georgia and others even closer to the core of Europe. Russia is engaged in an effort to ideologically subvert European democracies. And again, I think if you get pro-Russian governments coming to power in any of these countries, that also counts as a foreign policy victory for Putin. So I think there's a role for all of us to actually look a little closer to home and think about the link between our own security strategies and domestic politics in Russia. And there's a win-win for the West here, if we can be serious and strategic.
Excellent. In fact, it links very well with what I wanted to ask before we turn to the audience for a quick view from the panelists, and it's the denial of Putin's foreign policy victories. One other victory, or at least a challenge that we are seeing, a potential nugget there to get, is more of a Kremlin's Russia's challenge to NATO itself. In this part of the world, we see very much ability of the Russian forces to escalate much faster, much more significantly than the NATO side. There is a huge advantage, 10-1, when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons. And the theme that drives the security conversation in really the whole flank of the alliance is the concept of deterrence as a key for denying Putin this potential last big one foreign policy victory. And I wanted to turn to all of you, and maybe starting with Constanze, with you, in terms of what should be done, both according to you, and how much appetite there is, you think, in Berlin and in DC to provide a real effective deterrence on the flanks, either way, to stand strongly to Putin's regime.
Okay, thank you. That's an important question, and I know it's one on which the incoming Polish government has views that I think may be at odds, or maybe not. It depends on how this develops, with other European governments, with the current administration in Washington, and indeed with Berlin. Let me try and tease that out. I think where we probably agree is in the importance of thinking of deterrence not just in military terms, but in overall political, economic, and social terms. In other words, a concept of deterrence that starts with resilience. In other words, with getting it right at home. And that includes, of course, the integration of Russian-speaking minorities. It includes addressing hybrid warfare. It includes addressing Russian propaganda. And addressing all the issues where a Vladimir Putin can point at real flaws, double standards, etc., inequalities, and so on. So we do have to look to our own democracies. We have to look to our social contracts, and we have to look to the legitimacy of our foreign policies. And it's true when Dan Twining is correct when he says that there are certainly governments in Europe that have shown themselves vulnerable to Russian influence, and I think that ought to be a matter of great concern to us. And it certainly is a concern to Berlin, I know that for sure. But we do, of course, also have to look at the military side. And here I think the difference, the key difference, it seems to me, between what we've heard from the incoming Polish government and probably Berlin is on this question of the NATO-Russia Act and of permanent basing in the Baltics or in Poland. I think the line that the German government takes, and I think I personally have some sympathy for that, is that as it were, reneging on the NATO-Russia Act, even if we all feel that it's been essentially, trampled on by the other side, is something you save up. And that it is possible to do a lot of things in terms of reassurance, building resilience, and persistent rotation, and all these other buzzwords that get thrown around, without actually stationing tank brigades in Poland or the Baltics. I think that seems to me that where most of NATO is at, and where the Germans are at as well. I also worry, frankly, that the military value of this kind of permanent stationing is a lot less than it is made out to be by some of its advocates. I do think, though, that from what I've seen in Germany, and I've been part both of the foreign policy review process and of the current ongoing defense white book process as an expert brought in for consultations and workshops, I do think that this lot of German defense policymakers is as determined to get this right as I've ever seen in a long time. The German defense minister has and in fact, even more important, the German finance minister has said that we are going to get a 6% defense budget increase. That still doesn't bring us up to the 2% we promised to NATO because of the size of our economy and the growth rates that we still have. But there is a lot of movement afoot to create a sizable, substantial, and effective German contribution. And the interesting thing, just one last point here, the interesting thing is that all this is happening, it's discussed in public, and you don't see normal Germans protesting this. I mean, the much criticized German pacifism of earlier years is really not in evidence on this one. I think most Germans, and polls show this as well, agree that this is something that we have to do and where we have to show support. I think where we disagree is on the exact way in which we do this.
There are lots of colleagues here from the MFA, and I'm sure we will talk about it at the next panel. I'm not sure if the permanent basis is something that is the yardstick. There was just a meeting in Bucharest of the presidents of the flank where the language was actually robust, sustainable presence. But presence and forward presence and reinforcement, I think, are the buzzwords that the government is shooting for. I would like to go to the question. So if I can just turn to Ilya for your views on what would be the deterrence that works? and frankly, also, how is the NATO's and Western foreign policy perceived by people in Moscow or even population more widely? I mean, is it provocative, or is it, on the other side, seen as weakness? Right? Your take on, but also, what would be the deterrence that works from the position of Russia?
How it's perceived? NATO is perceived as the organization who is permanently bombing somebody. That's how it's perceived. Whether it's been seen as a real force, I wouldn't say so. It's like some vague threat, which has been recognized as threat that we see as an enemy. But I don't think that anybody in Russia would explain why is it enemy. And what particular threat it represents for Russian people. But it really doesn't matter, because what we see is the most volatile in national polls is this relationship with the West. We saw a couple of years ago 60% approval rating for United States. Now we see it's at all times lower than during Soviet Union times, lower than during the Cold War times. It's around like 10% approval. But I have zero doubt that if media emphasis would shift, it will go back into 50s, 60s, absolutely no problem. So I don't think that it's something fundamental. The fundamental thing is about the vital people's interests. And vital interest is like how much you eat, what are your wage, what is your social system, what is your education system. And the worst thing that happened during the last 25 years, that all the decay in Russian infrastructure was associated with malicious actions of the West. And that's the most fundamental thing that we see. And that's why it's so important to be successful in Ukraine. Because you need success story. There is no success story. West doesn't bring any kind of success story into our part of the world. Baltic states are neither a success story. Because many people from Baltic states have left and Russians are being oppressed in the Baltic states. That's what is being communicated back inside country. And that's why it's not a success story. Yes, people don't want to leave Baltic states, but still, you know, they like to tell stories, you know, how they treated unjustly, unevenly, and things like that. So to fix this is most important. And you have your mediators, you have your envoys inside Russian society, and I totally agree when I was talking about the bridge and everything. The same, like 15% of population, it's still like 20-30 million people. That's a lot. And Russian diaspora who recently left Russia, since the beginning of Ukrainian war, it's almost 1.5 million people who left Russia. It's 1% of population. Just the numbers is not, you know, something that we are making up. In US alone, last year, official number of USCIS, 300,000 of work and immigrant visas were issued for Russian nationals. In Europe, I don't know the total number of all different types of visas, but green cards, 75,000 last year for Russians. That means like you have to multiply 10 times at least, you know, to get a combined number for work visas and everything. That's huge numbers. And nobody is working politically with Russian diaspora. Nobody. At best, there are some programs for assimilation in different countries, like in Germany, for example. But there is not a single political program to work with diaspora, and diaspora are the people who are best positioned to influence the situation back home.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions and comments. So if you could signal your willingness to raise hands and introduce yourself specifically to a specific person. I saw Roland first, and I have a couple. We'll do 3-4 questions in the first round.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Michał. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels. And Constanze, I mean, since you crossed the pond, you may spend a lot of time on planes, but we don't see enough of you in places like Warsaw and Brussels. So we've got withdrawal symptoms. Anyway, now I want to come back to this dialectics of diplomacy and deterrence. And if our main argument about the permanent bases, or boots on the ground, whatever you call it, all the stuff that the current majority of NATO countries wants to stop short of, if we talk about all that, the ultimate argument against that is, whoever you talk to, it would unnecessarily provoke Russia, it would escalate the situation, and therefore it's a bad thing. Now that discussion has taken on its own dynamics and is becoming an element in the communication between Russia and the West. So my question to you is, are we strengthening deterrence if we are demonstrating in such a blatant way about this question and many, many others, like, you know, possible potential NATO membership of Ukraine? You remember the debate about arms for Ukraine of last year. The ultimate argument, the punchline was always it would unnecessarily escalate the situation. What are we communicating to Russia?
Great. If you could pass it on to the front row, right in front. Okay. Michał Miarka in the, yes. And we'll take the questions and then we'll go to the panel.
Right. Michał Miarka, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Security Policy Department. Great panel. Thank you all. Thanks, Michał, and thanks, Constanze, for coming back to Warsaw. Always good to see you. A point of clarification and a question. The permanent, the P word, It literally sounds like a bad word now. This is something that came up in the narrative with the Russian-Ukraine crisis from Germany, not from Poland. It is the word that comes out from the NATO-Russia Founding Act, not from the Polish narrative on security policy. It is the reaction to an excuse that the NATO-Russia Founding Act is being used somewhat lightly by some to explain why there would be an issue with a substantial footprint or boots on the ground, whatever you want to call it, in the Baltic countries, in Poland, and countries to the east. Whereas at the same time, conveniently forgetting the elements of the phrases or the paras in the NATO-Russia Founding Act that talk about Russian constraint, exactly the same level of constraint, by the way, in placing their forces close to NATO borders, which obviously didn't happen not only in the last 2 years, but also in the last 10 or 15 years, actually. The question I have, though, is about the paradigm. And it sort of links up to the previous question. There seems to have been a paradigm in a number of Western capitals that we cannot really strengthen our position in military terms vis-à-vis Russia or any other threat, because it would undermine our efforts, legitimate efforts, in engaging Russia wherever we can, regardless of whether this is pre-Russia-Ukraine crisis or during. How, if any, can we change the paradigm? What changed in the thinking in Berlin that since Ostpolitik with 300,000 US troops on the ground and then elements of engagement were possible was fruitful, to the current thinking that we can't do anything, we can't show strength to actually allow us to build better, more fruitful, more mutually beneficial relations with Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there is a question here from the first row. Then...
Thank you. I'm Ingrid Detter, the Francopan of the Academy of War Studies in France. I specialize in the law of war and rather how to prevent that and also armed conflict or any conflict. I know that history is always written by the winners, but I don't think I remember ever recent history being so distorted as it seems to be now in this, to me, rather obvious climate of Russophobia. Because I gave a talk in the European Parliament as an expert on the law of war 2 years ago, and I said, hands off Syria, learn from the debacle. Christians were better off under Gaddafi, Mubarak, and even Saddam Hussein. And the only one who blocked the vote in the Security Council to invade Syria was Putin and China. Now, then all of a sudden, ISIS appeared like a mushroom from absolutely nowhere, and Mr. Obama and his allies said, in we go. And I do think one should give credit for, when we talk about Putin's reputation and his foreign victories or debacle, that he actually did stop and delay that intervention, because my point in the European Parliament was that the rebels in Syria were not, or are not, like in other countries, united. They were widely split and heavily infiltrated by Al-Qaeda. And that was a suicide mission that I think we should still try to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A gentleman here in the...
Hi, my name is Reinhard Krum. I'm from the Ebert Foundation, and I have 2 short comments, but you can convert them into a question. The first one about propaganda and anti-propaganda. I think one of the issues one should think about analyzing is perception. I think the perception in Russia and in the West, in the EU and the United States about the 90s are completely different. Whereas in the West, we think the 90s were fantastic, unification, prosperity starting in Central Europe. In Russia, it's completely different, and I think Ilya was talking about that. You hear this from the Russian side, and you hear this also in Brussels and Berlin and France and Washington. Now, nobody has done a very precise analysis where we differ. There's a lot of myth in there, and I think this would be worthwhile analyzing, and this could be part of a effort Mr. Pomianowski was talking about. That's the first. The second, talking about what to do. I think in Germany, and Constanze was partly talking about this, we have this idea of congagement, and I have to say we stole this from the US. Congagement meaning containment and engagement at the same time, and it varies also on the position of Russia, how much percentage of engagement and how much percentage of containment. But it also depends on the interests of the EU and the United States, and I think we haven't done enough to point out what we really want. Putting military somewhere is one thing, but this is not the interest. We have different interests and we have to define them, and then we can have this policy of congagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this will be the last question, because then we'll go to the panel, because I've been told we have 6 minutes, not more. So I think it's Alan Riley. Okay, excellent.
I suppose this is Alan Riley, Institute for Statecraft, London. This is largely to Ilya, I suppose. I've got some good news for you. In fact, Russian language applications are perfectly acceptable in significant parts of British local government. So, for example, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea will accept quite happily planning applications in Russian. So I'm reliably informed. My question is about how, I think the Erasmus idea you gave was a fantastic one and something we should support. The question about how else you can actually begin to engage with the Russian population and have impact. I think the issue about television and TV broadcasts is really quite interesting in actually creating a space for Russian opposition, for Russian culture and Russian life. And I was wondering if part of the answer to this is to create a kind of double impact. Will be to actually, for the BBC, Voice of America, to create a major Russian language media operation in terms of encouraging the culture and also running TV channels and so forth and creating new programs and content, is by basing that operation in Kiev. So you actually have an impact in the Ukrainian environment and you broadcast out into Russia as well. And I think you could actually create, and of course, from Kiev, you could have lots of Russians coming from Moscow and St. Petersburg and elsewhere, who actually the possibility of having jobs and actually engaging in Russian cultural interchange and political and social interchange in Kiev, and then broadcasting it out into the broader Russian world. So I think that's something we should kind of think about. But as I say, if you want to make a planning application in Russian, in England, I recommend the best place is the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for great questions. I'll want to now go the other way around, starting with you. If you could choose, rather than addressing all of them, because we will run out of time, and there were like 5 questions to Constanze, so we'll go last with you, but with you. Okay, over to you, sir.
Yeah, I will focus on 2 issues. Number one, thank you very much. We're all good friends about this contagion. But I think it's no accident that such words do not exist in our language, because it's not possible. And I think that is one of the main problems of 90s and 2000s, global problems, cultural problems, that we start to live in this postmodernism world where we try to combine uncombinable. And we in Russia feel this very well, because when you from one hand engage, from other hand contain, that means there's a very double-faced and very inconsistent policy. And that's what Russian elite take it. You know, it's not serious. Right now there are sanctions. Tomorrow there will be no sanctions. Republicans will come, and we always negotiate with Republicans everything. Or Hillary will come, even more we'll negotiate with Hillary. That's how Russian elites take it. And that's why this overall Putin's approach that people respect only force, and that's his genuine belief, is always actually works in international policies. And this is what is bad. And that's why I'm saying, you know, that it's better not to engage, not to cooperate, not to talk at all for a moment, but to do something on your own territory. Because values are what West is strong of. values, focusing on those values and showing that those values are genuine and the relationship towards those values is genuine and that it cannot be sacrificed for some short-term benefits. And second thing, which I think is pretty important to understand, is your point about TV and BBC and CNN. Propaganda is not in the news. News is one tiny piece of propaganda machine. Propaganda is in soap operas. Propaganda is in talk shows. Propaganda is in entertainment. And Russian TV is brilliant in entertainment. It's a very, very high quality product. Way better than many of US, European news stations. And if somebody wants to create a counter-propaganda, it needs to create a TV channel which is not worse than first channel of Russia in terms of entertainment. You need to have movies production. You need to have serious production. You need to have those shows production. Otherwise, it will not work. And by spending money on news, it's a waste of time, waste of effort, waste of very precious resource.
Minister Pomianowski.
Well, I don't know, Ilya, have you read our report, but you are quoting the big part of the report on Russian language media specifically. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ilya, for support. But indeed, this is one of the recommendations we're saying to set up, for example, production center that finance non-news production for independent media outlets. So it's a very simple recommendation and a very simple action, but it's very difficult to implement it in the present state of mind of many governments in Europe and US and Canada. But let me address one issue about the perception from our colleagues from EBA Foundation. It is true. A lot of work and the engineering of minds of Russian people by Putin is based on the effort and strategy and tricks to manipulate perceptions. Some of those perceptions are right, some of wrong, but all of those is based on manipulating perceptions, and we could easily see those layers. The perception of 90s, the perception of history, so starting saying that the Crimea is a birthplace of the Russian history, and many others, perception of the World War II. You see how a big reaction was from Putin regarding a small comment that those who were liberating Auschwitz, there were many Ukrainian soldiers there. I mean, you cannot say that inside Soviet army they were Ukrainians, because the Russian soldier, Soviet soldier, is a Russian soldier. Yeah? So this is those perceptions. And when we were analyzing main TV channels, we discover that it's full of those type of manipulations. But at the same time, there is a huge weakness in those main Kremlin-controlled channels. They do not tell daily stories of people. So they do not look into backyard of the Russian people, what is happening in your neighborhood, what is happening, what are the people's life stories. These things are not really well presented, less than 1% of the total time. And that is an extremely important entry point for any media activity that are independent. Bring back real life to the screen. That will attract people's attention. That will complement the high quality, high budgeted entertainment, because people want to see what is really happening to them. So there are ways to broad back people to the TV channels, TV programs, internet-based media that will offer something that they are missing from those propagandistic channels.
Thank you very much. Dan.
Michael, I just want to respond very specifically to our friend from France on this question of Western intervention and Russian intervention in Syria. I think if it had been an immaculate situation in which nobody had been intervening, this might be a compelling point. However, our former military commander in the Middle East, General Jim Mattis, has made the claim very strongly that the reason Assad was able to hold on to power in Syria was because of battlefield intervention by Iran, right? So including 2-3 years ago, the reason Assad is still in power is because of foreign intervention. And now, of course, Russian foreign intervention is sustaining him in power. And I think if you're European or American, you have to ask the simple question. If Iran and Russia are intervening, is it better for us to stand back, or would it actually be better for us to have intervened or to be intervening? Because surely the West, I hope, will pursue a more enlightened policy than will the forces of Hezbollah and Putin. So I think this is a simple binary choice. Second, I don't think anything in the international laws of war, which are very sacrosanct, permit barrel bombing one's own population, using chemical and other weapons against women and children, civilians in your own country. So I don't think there's any standing for an argument about international law somehow preventing the West from intervening in this scenario. Finally, last time I was in Paris, very senior officials at the Quai d'Orsay lectured us on the American side about the fact that President Obama had decided not to intervene in Syria. The French jets were on the runway, ready to go. And our French government official friends said that it was American inaction that then produced European inaction that made the situation that much worse. Donc je crois que même en France, on a les différences d'opinion.
All right. Michał, thank you for your welcome. That's very kind of you. And Roland, thank you for not asking you a question in Polish, because otherwise I wouldn't have understood it. Apologies. But now, to be serious, I understand your concern, Michał, about Germans always talking about escalation dominance and how we shouldn't provoke the Russians. This is how do I put this? It's a meme of German discourse. I'm not going to deny that. But I think it belongs to an older generation, and a sort of a reflex, a deeply ingrained reflex, I'll grant you that, from the Cold War, that you will find in German arguments. But I would say to those of you, and I personally have a problem with that, because I think it's used as an excuse. But I would also urge you, and I'm sure that you already do this, to look at all the other things that Germany is doing. Yeah? And let me just reel off some of those. Germany has cancelled formally the strategic relationship with Russia. Yeah? This, I would say, is the most significant loss that Putin has incurred in this whole period of 24 months. He's lost what he always considered as his strategic bridgehead into Europe, Germany. That's gone. Yeah? It may still be there in the mind of some Germans, but trust me, in the Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry, that's not there. The Germans are heavily invested in Ukrainian transformation. You could still argue that we're not doing enough, and that all of us are not doing enough, and that's an argument one can make. But if I look at how hard the Ukraine task force in the German Foreign Ministry is working on this, and if I look at friends of mine, a friend of mine who was a co-witness at my best friend's wedding, who is now the deputy president of an appellate court in the Rhineland, I wrote to him after a visit to Kiev 2 weeks ago and said, do you know of any efforts in the German judiciary to help judiciary reform in Ukraine? He wrote back and said, you know what, I've just been there. I'm just back from there 20 minutes ago, and on my initiative, my court is now undertaking support for retraining young Ukrainian judges, and we're starting in December with the first visit, and the formal program start in January. And this never went through the Justice Ministry or the Foreign Ministry. People are taking this up on their own initiative. Yeah? So there is already a civil society network, and I think that tells you something, that the Germans are taking these efforts seriously, believe in them, and try to support them. I would also say to you, and I think many of you know this, but it's worth repeating, that there is a strategic relationship, and more than that, an emotional relationship between Germany and Poland. Yeah? We feel a historic obligation, but we also feel a current obligation. And Ukraine is your security concern, so it's ours as well. And finally, one important point to all of you who worry about the Germans talking about escalation dominance. I mean, the Germans are also very, very angry about the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, and that includes the public. Poles went the other way on Russia after the downing of MH17 and the murder of Nemtsov, and they're still very critical of Russia. And finally, I would say to you, if there's one thing that a new generation of Germans feels very strongly about, it's the denial of agency to civil society. It is the support for fascist parties in Europe. And it is the undermining of the European public opinion space through trolling and Russian propaganda. That is something that ordinary Germans who don't think about deterrence and containment and reassurance are upset about and angry about. Yeah. And that is, I think, the worst way in which Russia has damaged its relations with Germany. And I think that is a damage that is very, I find it hard to imagine how that could be undone, you know, despite all the sympathies or worries or sort of Cold War reflexes that you will still find.
Thank you very much. I must say I'm impressed with the breadth of the conversation. I thought we'll talk about geopolitics, but we in fact had very much conversation both about geopolitics and what we can do about Russia internally with some very concrete ideas. This word of containment still sort of hangs here, and I think we'll keep discussing it later today, and whether we don't have to make a choice here a little bit more between containment and engagement. Please join me in thanking the panelists for this great conversation.